I moved my savings to a new account on a quiet Tuesday morning, and 3 hours later my daughter-in-law was standing on my front porch screaming my name as if her life depended on it. That was the moment I realized something was terribly wrong. I'm Helen Carter. I'm 71 years old, a widow, and until recently I believed the people closest to me wanted what was best for me. Looking back now, I can see how many signs I ignored, but on that morning, all I knew was that a simple visit to the bank had somehow triggered a storm. The day had started like any other. I woke up just after 6, made myself a cup of coffee, and sat by the kitchen window overlooking my backyard. The maple tree my late husband planted 20 years ago was beginning to turn green again. Spring always made me think of him. Richard loved mornings. He used to sit across from me at the same table, reading the newspaper while I watered the plants. After he passed away 4 years ago, the house became quieter than I ever imagined possible. You learn to live with silence, but you never really become friends with it. For several weeks, something had been bothering me. Small things. Strange things. I would log into my online banking and find password reset notifications I didn't remember requesting. A customer service representative once asked whether I had recently updated my contact preferences. I hadn't. None of it seemed serious enough to panic over, but together it created an uncomfortable feeling I couldn't shake. So that Tuesday, I drove 12 miles to my local bank branch and asked to speak with someone about opening a new account. The banker was polite and efficient. Within an hour, my savings had been transferred. $187,000. Every dollar I had spent decades earning, saving, and protecting. I left feeling relieved. Not frightened. Not suspicious. Just relieved. On the drive home, I stopped at a grocery store, bought fresh fruit, a loaf of wheat bread, and a carton of milk. The sky was clear. The radio played old songs I recognized. Everything felt ordinary. That feeling lasted exactly 3 hours. I was putting groceries away when I heard the first knock. It wasn't really a knock. It was more like someone striking the front door with the flat of their hand. Once. Twice. Then again. I walked toward the entryway expecting to see a delivery driver. Instead, I looked through the glass panel and saw Amber, my daughter-in-law. Her face was red. Her hair looked rushed and uneven, as though she had left in a hurry. She wasn't standing calmly. She was pacing across my porch. The moment she saw me, she pointed toward the door. "Open this door, Helen," she shouted. My stomach tightened instantly. Amber had never spoken to me like that before. Not once in the 14 years she had been married to my son Jason. We were not especially close, but we were always polite. At least, I thought we were. I opened the door only a few inches. "Amber?" I asked. "What happened?" She stared at me with wide eyes. "What did you do?" she demanded. "Call the bank right now." I blinked. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play games with me," she snapped. "You changed it. You moved everything." For a second, neither of us spoke. My heart began beating harder. Not because she was angry. Because of what she had just said. She knew. Somehow she knew. I had told nobody. Not my son. Not my friends. Not even my sister. The transfer had happened only hours earlier. Yet Amber knew about it. And in that moment, standing in my doorway, I stopped hearing her words and started hearing a question that would change everything. How did my daughter-in-law know what happened inside my bank account before anyone else did? Amber kept talking, but I barely heard her. My mind had already moved somewhere else, somewhere quieter and far more unsettling. I looked at her standing on my porch, demanding answers about money that did not belong to her, and I realized I was no longer shocked by her anger. I was shocked by her knowledge. That was the part one could not explain. I had spent years convincing myself that Amber was simply protective of Jason. Whenever she asked questions about my finances, I assumed she was trying to help. Whenever she offered to organize paperwork, I thanked her. Whenever she reminded me to update passwords or review my insurance policies, I thought she was being thoughtful. Standing there that afternoon, I began replaying dozens of moments I had dismissed. Small moments. Harmless moments. At least that was what I had believed at the time. I folded my arms and looked at her calmly. "Amber, I think you should go home." Her eyes widened. She looked almost panicked. "Do not do this, Helen. Call the bank and fix it." Fix it. The words lingered in my mind long after she spoke them. Fix what? Why would moving my own savings require fixing anything? She opened her mouth as if she wanted to say more, then suddenly stopped herself. A few seconds later she turned around, walked quickly to her car, and drove away without another word. I remained on the porch long after she disappeared down the street. The neighborhood was quiet. A lawnmower hummed somewhere in the distance. Across the road, Mrs. Turner was walking her golden retriever. Everything looked normal. Yet nothing felt normal anymore. That evening I sat alone in my living room with an old photo album on my lap. It was something I often did when I missed Richard. The photographs showed birthdays, family vacations, school graduations, and holidays. Jason smiled from nearly every page. As a little boy, he had followed me everywhere. When he scraped his knee, he wanted his mother. When he had a nightmare, he wanted his mother. When he graduated college, the first person he hugged was his mother. Sometimes I wondered where that young man had gone. After he married Amber, things changed gradually. Not overnight. Never dramatically enough to attract attention. Phone calls became shorter. Visits became less frequent. Decisions that once involved family suddenly seemed to happen without me. Whenever I questioned it, I blamed myself. Maybe that was simply what happened when children built lives of their own. But there was another thing I remembered. Amber always seemed unusually interested in financial conversations. At Thanksgiving dinners, she would ask about retirement accounts. At Christmas, she would ask whether I had updated my will. During family gatherings, she somehow knew details I had never mentioned. Once she asked whether a medical bill had finally been paid. I never remembered telling her about that bill. Another time, she asked if a pension deposit had arrived on schedule. Again, I had never mentioned it. At the time, I laughed it off. Now those memories felt different. They felt heavier. Around 9 o'clock that evening, I logged into my online banking profile. Everything appeared normal. The new account was active. The funds had transferred successfully. There were no suspicious transactions. Yet as I reviewed the security settings, I noticed something that made me sit up straighter. Under account notifications, there were multiple alert preferences enabled. Some of them were settings I did not remember choosing. My heart began beating faster. I stared at the screen for nearly a minute. Then I reached for my reading glasses and looked again. The alerts had been active for years. Suddenly, Amber's reaction earlier that day made a little more sense. But it also raised a far more troubling question. If someone had been receiving notifications connected to my financial activity, who had authorized it in the first place? The next morning, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, another memory surfaced. A comment Amber had made. A question she should not have known to ask. A detail she somehow already understood. By 7 o'clock, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a yellow notepad and a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. For the first time in years, I decided to stop explaining away the things that made me uncomfortable. Instead, I started writing them down. The list grew faster than I expected. 3 years earlier, Amber had called me asking whether a deposit from my late husband's life insurance policy had finally arrived. I remember being surprised because I had not mentioned the payment to anyone. She laughed and said she must have remembered something I told her months before. At the time, I accepted the explanation. Now I was not so sure. Another memory followed. 2 years ago, I changed internet providers and updated several online accounts. Less than 24 hours later, Amber casually asked whether I had trouble logging into my bank website after changing passwords. I had stared at her for a moment, wondering how she knew I had changed anything. She immediately changed the subject, and I forgot about it. Or at least I thought I had forgotten. The more I wrote, the more uneasy I became. Around 10 o'clock, I decided to call the bank. Not customer service. The branch directly. A receptionist connected me with Robert Hayes, a manager I had known for years. Robert had helped Richard and me refinance our home nearly 2 decades earlier. His voice was calm and familiar. After a few minutes of polite conversation, I explained what had happened. I did not accuse anyone. I simply described Amber's reaction after I moved the money. Silence followed. Not a long silence. Just long enough for me to notice it. "Helen," Robert finally said, "would you be willing to come in this afternoon?" My stomach tightened. "Is something wrong?" I asked. "I think it would be better if we discussed a few things in person." The drive to the bank felt longer than usual. Every red light seemed to last forever. By the time I arrived, I was more nervous than I wanted to admit. Robert greeted me in his office and closed the door behind us. He did not waste time. He turned his computer screen toward me and opened a series of account settings and notification records. At first, I did not understand what I was looking at. Then he pointed to several entries. Alert subscriptions, security notifications, transaction updates, account activity reports. Some were sent by email, others by text message. My eyes moved slowly across the information. There were phone numbers I recognized. There were email addresses I did not. "Robert," I said quietly, "what exactly am I looking at?" He folded his hands on the desk. "These are notification settings associated with your account history." I looked again. Most had been active for years. Years. My pulse quickened. "Can someone receive these alerts without my knowledge?" I asked. Robert hesitated carefully before answering. "Normally, changes require authorization. However, authorization can sometimes occur during account updates, document reviews, beneficiary changes, or bundled paperwork." I felt suddenly cold despite the warm office. Beneficiary changes, account reviews, paperwork. During the months after Richard died, I had signed dozens of forms while grieving. Some were from insurance companies. Some were from financial institutions. Some I barely remembered reading. Robert leaned forward slightly. "Helen, there's something else you should probably see." He clicked another screen and opened a historical activity log. My heart nearly stopped when I saw the dates. Multiple account notifications had been modified shortly after Richard's funeral. And for the first time, I began to wonder whether someone had taken advantage of the most vulnerable period of my life. For several seconds, I could not speak. I simply stared at the dates on the screen. Richard's funeral had been held on a rainy Thursday afternoon in October. I remembered every detail of that week. The casseroles neighbors brought to the house. The sympathy cards stacked on the dining room table. The exhaustion that followed me from room to room. Grief had a way of turning ordinary tasks into impossible ones. Some mornings I could barely decide what to eat for breakfast. Yet, according to the records in front of me, important changes had been made to my banking profile during that exact period. "Can you show me the documents connected to those updates?" I finally asked. Robert nodded and opened another file. Several electronic forms appeared on the screen. Most looked familiar. Beneficiary confirmations, contact preference updates, security verification forms. Then I noticed something strange. One signature looked like mine, but not entirely. The letters were correct. The style was similar. Yet something about it felt off. It looked rushed, unsteady, almost as if someone had copied it after seeing it many times. I leaned closer. "I do not remember signing this." Robert remained careful with his words. "I cannot determine whether a signature is valid. I can only tell you it was submitted as authorization." My chest tightened. I thought back to those months after Richard passed away. Jason and Amber had been around constantly. At the time, I appreciated the help. Amber offered to organize paperwork. She sorted mail. She scheduled appointments. She even accompanied me to meetings when I felt overwhelmed. Everyone praised her kindness, including me. One memory suddenly surfaced. About 3 weeks after the funeral, Amber had arrived carrying a folder filled with documents. She placed sticky notes on various pages and told me where to sign. I remembered asking whether I should read everything first. She smiled warmly and said she had already reviewed it all. "It is just routine paperwork, Helen." At the time, I was too tired to argue. I trusted her. The memory made my stomach sink. Had one of those pages contained something I never truly understood? Robert printed several records for me to review at home. As he handed me the folder, he paused. "Helen, I want to be clear about something. We do not yet know whether anything improper occurred. But given your concerns, I think it would be wise to examine every document carefully. I thanked him and left the bank with the folder resting on the passenger seat beside me. During the drive home, I felt strangely calm. Not because I was comfortable. Quite the opposite. The pieces were beginning to connect, and that frightened me more than uncertainty ever had. When I arrived home, I spread the papers across my dining room table. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating page after page of financial records. For hours, I compared signatures, dates, and account settings. Most of it was tedious. Then I found something that made me stop. One notification email listed in the records looked partially familiar. The address was not mine. Yet I had seen it before. I sat back in my chair, searching my memory. Where had I seen it? A holiday invitation. A shared family calendar. Then it hit me. The email belonged to Amber. I stared at the page for a long moment. If the records were accurate, account activity notifications connected to my finances had been linked to an address controlled by my daughter-in-law. Suddenly, her panic on my porch made perfect sense. She had not reacted because she cared about me. She had reacted because something she expected to monitor had suddenly disappeared. But one question still haunted me. If Amber had access to information about my finances, was she acting alone, or had my son known about it the entire time? That question followed me through the rest of the week. Every time I looked at a photograph of Jason, every time I saw his name appear on my phone, every time I passed the baseball trophy he won at 14 sitting on my bookshelf, I asked myself the same thing. Did he know? I wanted the answer to be no. More than that, I needed the answer to be no. A mother can survive disappointment. She can survive loneliness. But discovering that her own child willingly betrayed her is a different kind of pain. I decided not to confront anyone. Not yet. The strongest thing I could do was remain silent and keep watching. On Friday afternoon, Jason called. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. He asked how I was doing, whether I needed anything from the grocery store, whether I had plans for the weekend. The conversation felt rehearsed. Artificial. Almost as if he was checking on something rather than checking on me. Then came the question I had been expecting. Everything okay with the bank? He asked casually. I stared out my kitchen window at the bird feeder in the backyard. A cardinal landed on the edge and pecked at a sunflower seed. Why do you ask? I replied. There was a pause. Very brief. But I noticed it. Oh, no reason. Amber mentioned you had gone there recently. I thanked him for calling and ended the conversation a few minutes later. The moment I hung up, I wrote the exchange down in my notebook. That notebook was becoming thicker every day. Dates. Comments. Questions. Small observations. Individually, they meant very little. Together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. The following Monday, I met my longtime friend Lisa Monroe for lunch. Lisa and I had known each other for more than 30 years. She was one of the few people who still spoke to me with complete honesty. We sat in a quiet diner a few miles from my house. After listening carefully to everything that had happened, she stirred her iced tea and frowned. Helen, can I ask you something? I nodded. Has Amber always been this interested in your finances? The question made me laugh softly, though there was no humor in it. I think I stopped noticing years ago. Lisa leaned back in her booth. That is what worries me. On the drive home, her words stayed with me. I began reviewing old emails and account records again. This time I searched for something specific. Mentions of passwords. Security updates. Notification changes. Late that evening, I found an email from nearly 3 years earlier. It was a routine message confirming that account alerts had been modified. At the time, I ignored it because everything appeared normal. Now I looked closer. The change had occurred only 2 days after Amber spent an entire afternoon helping me organize financial documents after Richard's death. My stomach tightened. The timeline fit too perfectly. Then another detail caught my attention. At the bottom of the email was a reference number connected to the modification request. I copied it onto my notepad. The next morning, I planned to call Robert and ask whether that number could reveal who initiated the change. I sat back in my chair and looked around the quiet house. For years, I thought my greatest challenge was learning how to live without my husband. Now I was beginning to understand that someone may have been quietly watching my financial life from the shadows for far longer than I ever imagined. And if the reference number revealed what I feared it might, I was finally going to learn how deep that access really went. The next morning, I called Robert as soon as the bank opened. I had the reference number written on a yellow sticky note beside my coffee cup, and I read it to him carefully. He asked me to hold for a few minutes while he reviewed the records. Those few minutes felt longer than the entire previous week. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the clock above the stove, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic from the main road. When Robert returned to the line, his voice sounded more serious than usual. "Helen, I found the record connected to that modification." My hand tightened around the phone. "What does it say?" There was a brief pause. "The request appears to have originated from a device that had previously been used to access your account information with your permission." I frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means someone who had legitimate access to your account at some point used the same device during the update process." I thanked him and ended the call, but his answer stayed with me. A device that had previously been used with my permission. Immediately, another memory surfaced. About 3 years earlier, my laptop had stopped working after a software update. I remember calling Jason for help. He and Amber came over that evening. Jason looked at the computer for a few minutes before giving up and suggesting I use Amber's laptop to access a few important accounts while he worked on mine. I remembered sitting at my dining room table entering usernames and passwords while Amber sat across from me smiling patiently. At the time it seemed harmless. Family helping family. Now I wondered whether that evening had been far more important than I realized. Later that afternoon, Jason stopped by unexpectedly. He carried a bag of groceries and wore the same friendly smile he always used when trying to appear relaxed. "I was in the neighborhood," he said. "Thought I would check on you." I invited him inside and watched him carefully as he unpacked fruit and vegetables onto the kitchen counter. For years I would have seen only my son. Now I found myself studying every expression, every hesitation, every glance. After a few minutes, he casually asked whether everything had settled down since Amber's visit. The question immediately caught my attention. Not whether I was doing well. Not whether I needed anything. Whether everything had settled down. "Things are fine," I replied. "Why would they not be?" Jason forced a small laugh. "You know Amber. She gets emotional sometimes." Emotional. That was an interesting choice of words. Emotional people usually react after learning bad news. Amber had reacted within hours of a private banking decision she should never have known about. Jason remained for nearly an hour. During that time, he brought up financial topics 3 separate times. Property taxes. Retirement planning. Estate documents. Each subject appeared naturally in conversation, yet together they felt strangely deliberate. When he finally left, I sat alone and reviewed my notes again. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Amber seemed to possess information she should not have. Jason seemed unusually interested in whether I noticed. Neither behavior proved anything by itself. But together they painted a picture I did not want to see. That evening I made a decision. I would stop looking backward and start testing what was happening in real time. If someone was still monitoring my financial activity, there had to be a way to prove it. And for the first time since this entire situation began, I realized I might not need a confession. I might only need an opportunity. The following morning, I drove back to the bank and opened a small secondary savings account. There was nothing unusual about it. People open new accounts every day. I deposited $5,000 and arranged for the account to remain separate from my primary savings. Then I returned home and began the second part of my plan. If someone was quietly monitoring my financial activity, I needed to give them something to watch. 2 days later, Jason and Amber came over for dinner. I made pot roast, green beans, and the apple pie Richard used to love. The evening felt surprisingly normal. We talked about the weather, a road construction project near their neighborhood, and a family friend's retirement. Amber smiled often. Jason seemed relaxed. Watching them, it was almost possible to believe none of my suspicions were real. Almost. As we cleared the dishes, I casually mentioned that I had been exploring new ways to organize my finances. I kept my tone light and unimportant. I finally moved a little money into a separate account for some future projects around the house, I said. Amber looked up immediately. The reaction lasted less than a second, but I noticed it. Her smile froze. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Then she resumed stacking plates as if nothing had happened. Jason glanced toward her before looking back at me. The moment passed quickly, yet it stayed with me all night. The next morning I called Robert and explained what I was doing. He agreed to place additional monitoring on the new account and promised to alert me if any unusual access attempts occurred. 3 days passed. Nothing happened. 4 days. Still nothing. By the 5th day, I began wondering whether I had been wrong all along. Perhaps the pattern I saw was only coincidence. Perhaps grief, loneliness, and suspicion had combined into something larger than reality. Then Friday afternoon arrived. I was watering flowers on my back patio when my phone rang. It was Robert. "Helen," he said, "I think you should come in." Less than an hour later, I was sitting across from him in the same office where this journey had truly begun. He turned his computer screen toward me. Several security alerts appeared on the display. Multiple login attempts. Repeated verification requests. Access activity directed toward the new account. My pulse quickened as I studied the records. Were they successful? I asked quietly. Robert shook his head. No. The security changes you requested prevented access. Relief washed over me, followed almost immediately by dread. Someone had tried. Someone had acted after learning about an account that only a handful of people even knew existed. Robert clicked another screen. Technical details appeared. Dates. Times. Device information. Location records. Then he pointed toward a line near the bottom. This is what caught my attention. I leaned closer. The device identifier matched a record connected to previous account activity reviews from years earlier. The same device family. The same access pattern. My hands became very still. Can you tell who owns it? I asked. Robert chose his words carefully. I cannot make that determination. But I can tell you that the similarities are significant. I stared at the screen for a long time. The evidence was no longer based on feelings, memories, or uneasy conversations. For the first time, there was a measurable pattern connecting the past to the present. Someone had learned about the new account shortly after I mentioned it. Someone had attempted to access information they had no reason to need. And whoever that person was, they had just made a mistake. Because now I finally had something far stronger than suspicion. After leaving the bank, I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired. For weeks I had hoped the evidence would point somewhere else. A misunderstanding. A technical error. Anything that would allow me to keep believing my family was exactly who I thought they were. Instead, every new piece of information seemed to narrow the possibilities. That weekend I invited Jason and Amber to Sunday dinner. Neither of them seemed surprised by the invitation. In fact, Amber appeared unusually cheerful when she arrived. She carried a bottle of sparkling cider and complimented the flowers on my front porch. Watching her smile, it was difficult to reconcile the woman standing in my kitchen with the growing stack of records sitting quietly inside my desk drawer. We ate roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. The conversation remained pleasant. Jason talked about work. Amber discussed a neighborhood charity event. Anyone looking through the dining room window would have seen an ordinary family sharing an ordinary meal. Yet beneath the surface, everything had changed. After dessert, I cleared the plates and returned to the table carrying a thin folder. My hands were steady. My voice was calm. "There is something I would like to discuss," I said. Jason immediately looked concerned. Amber's smile faded slightly. I opened the folder and removed several printed documents. Security logs. Notification records. Account activity reports. Nothing dramatic. Just facts. I placed the first page on the table. A few weeks ago, I discovered someone had been receiving alerts connected to my financial accounts. Silence settled across the room. Amber stared at the paper without touching it. Jason looked from me to her and back again. I continued speaking. Slowly. Carefully. I explained the notification settings. The historical records. The unauthorized monitoring concerns. Then I showed them the activity connected to the secondary account. The account that existed for only a few days before access attempts appeared. Jason's expression changed first. Confusion gave way to disbelief. Amber remained very still. "Helen, what exactly are you suggesting?" she asked. Her voice sounded controlled, but not quite as confident as before. "I am not suggesting anything," I replied. "I am describing what happened." I slid another document across the table. The account was mentioned during one dinner conversation. A few days later, someone attempted to access information connected to it. Jason picked up the paper and read it silently. Amber did not. She simply stared at the tabletop. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Jason turned toward his wife. "Amber?" It was a simple question. Just her name. Yet the room felt different afterward. Amber finally looked up. "I was only trying to help," she said quietly. The words hung in the air. Not a denial. Not an explanation. Just a statement that seemed far too small for everything that had happened. I looked at her for several seconds. "Help requires permission," I said. "Trust requires honesty." Jason lowered his eyes toward the documents again. His shoulders seemed heavier than before. No one raised their voice. No one argued. The truth did not need volume. It was already sitting on the table between us. As evening sunlight faded through the dining room windows, I realized something important. The investigation was over. The uncertainty that had followed me for weeks was finally gone. In its place was clarity. Painful clarity, but clarity nonetheless. And for the first time since Richard died, I felt completely certain about what I needed to do next. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. There were no dramatic phone calls, no emotional confrontations, no attempts to argue over what had happened. In many ways, that silence told me more than any explanation ever could. When people know they are innocent, they usually have questions. When people know they have crossed a line, they often become very quiet. I spent the next week putting my affairs in order. I met with Robert at the bank and finalized additional security measures on every account I owned. New passwords, new verification procedures, new contact restrictions. It was not about punishment. It was about protection. For the first time in years, I wanted complete control over my own financial life. I also met with an attorney. Not because I intended to cut anyone out of my life, but because I had learned a painful lesson. Trust is important. Documentation is essential. My will, estate plans, and account authorizations were reviewed and updated. Every instruction was written clearly. Every decision reflected my wishes alone. When I returned home that afternoon, I felt lighter than I had in months. The uncertainty that once followed me through every room had disappeared. A few days later, Jason called and asked if he could stop by. When he arrived, he looked tired. Older somehow. We sat on the back patio where Richard and I used to drink coffee on summer evenings. For a while, neither of us spoke. Finally, Jason looked down at his hands and said something I had been waiting to hear. I should have paid more attention. It was not a perfect apology. It was not a complete explanation. But it was honest. I nodded slowly. "Yes," I replied. "You should have." The conversation that followed was difficult, but calm. Jason admitted there were many times he ignored things because it was easier than asking questions. He assumed good intentions where he should have demanded transparency. He trusted situations he should have examined more carefully. I listened without interrupting. Sometimes accountability begins with recognizing what you chose not to see. Amber never came to my house again to discuss the matter. Months later, she sent a brief letter. She described her actions as attempts to help manage family finances and expressed regret for crossing boundaries. Whether that explanation was complete no longer mattered to me. Some questions do not need answers forever. At a certain point, peace becomes more valuable than certainty. As summer arrived, life settled into a new rhythm. I joined a gardening club. I spent more time with friends. I took weekend trips I had postponed for years. The money remained exactly where it belonged, but I discovered something important. The savings account had never been the real issue. The real issue was independence. The ability to make my own decisions. The confidence to trust my instincts when something felt wrong. One evening I sat beneath the maple tree Richard planted decades ago. The sun was setting behind the houses across the street, casting long shadows across the lawn. I thought about everything that had happened since that strange day when a simple banking decision revealed a hidden truth. The experience hurt. There was no denying that. But it also reminded me of something valuable. Growing older does not mean surrendering your judgment. It does not mean handing over your voice. And it certainly does not mean ignoring warning signs because they come from people you love. I looked up into the branches above me and smiled. The future felt different now. Not because my family had changed. Because I had. And the day someone lost access to my financial life became the day I regained full ownership of my own.